A man stood at the gate and watched a woman carry her dead husband's boots out to a wagon in a crate, and he did not look away once because Thaddeus Kane liked to see his work finished with his own eyes. By noon that day, Cassandra Whitfield, 43 years old, owned a mule, a satchel of her father's leather tools, and $6 sewn into the lining of a glove. And not one single acre of the ranch. She and her husband had spent 9 years building out of raw grass above Ashford Hollow, Montana territory. Everyone in that town believed they knew exactly how her story would end, because they had watched Kane end 3 stories exactly like it before. What none of them could have guessed was where she rode that same afternoon, straight past the boarding house, straight past the stage road out of town, up to a scorched and half-collapsed windmill on the ridge that every soul in the valley had spent 11 years too frightened to walk within a half-mile of. They called it the Widow's Folly. 3 people connected to that ruin had already lost a husband, a fortune, or their mind, and the story went that whatever lived up there had never once let go of what it took. Cassandra paid $5 silver for it, all she had left in the world besides the coins in her glove, to a county clerk who laughed so hard he nearly couldn't finish writing the deed. But what that clerk did not know, what not one living soul in Ashford Hollow had known for 11 long years, was that something had been sealed inside the stone base of that cursed mill on the very night it burned. Something worth far more than a ranch. Something a man had died protecting, rather than let it fall into the wrong hands. And it was about to change everything. Settle in, and let us tell you exactly what Cassandra Whitfield found in the dark. And if you are watching tonight from some corner of the world that has already decided what you are worth, some town that stopped looking at you twice, stay with us to the end, because before this story is over, you will understand exactly why that windmill was really cursed, and who it was truly protecting all along. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from tonight. Cassandra was raised in a saddle shop in the Nebraska Panhandle, the only daughter of a leather worker named Josiah Whitfield, a quiet, careful man who could look at a length of hide and tell you, before he ever cut it, exactly where it would want to bend, and exactly where it would fight him. He had no sons to hand the trade to, and no patience for the idea that a trade needed a son. And so Cassandra grew up with the smell of neat's foot oil in her hair, and the particular calm of a person who has learned that leather, unlike people, always tells you the truth if you are willing to run your hands slowly enough over it. Before she could read her letters, well, she could already tell a saddle skirt cut against the grain from one cut with it. And by the time she was 10, her father let her sit at the bench beside him of an evening, waxing thread between her small fingers while he showed her how a stitch pulled too tight would pucker a seam that ought to have lain flat for 20 years. He taught her to read a hide the way another man might read a face, to find the old scars and the thin places before they became a broken cinch on a runaway horse. And he told her once, stitching by lamplight with an awl clenched in his teeth, that the whole secret of his trade was patience with what looked finished. "Any fool can see a good hide," he said around the awl. "It takes a leather worker to see the good hide hiding inside a bad one." She carried a scrap of that hide philosophy in her apron pocket for the rest of her childhood, the way other girls carried ribbons. From her mother, Naomi, a midwife who was called out at all hours to farms and dugouts across 3 counties, she learned a different patience, the kind that sits up all night with a frightened woman and does not rush the thing that cannot be rushed, the kind that trusts a slow unfolding over a quick and violent one. Naomi would take Cassandra along on the shorter calls once she was old enough to hold a lamp steady and not faint at the sight of blood, and she taught her daughter, in the low voice she used in birthing rooms, that fear makes people want to hurry the very things that punish hurrying, and that the surest way to lose what you are trying to save is to grab at it too fast. She used to say that most disasters in this world were only babies born too fast by people too afraid to wait, and Cassandra carried that sentence with her the rest of her life without fully understanding it until the year it saved her. Between the leather and the lamplight, she grew into a young woman who trusted her hands over her fears, and who had already, long before she needed the lesson, learned that the world rarely destroys anything all the way through. It only convinces people to stop looking. She married Daniel Ashford at 24, a rangy gentleman whose family had given the town its name 2 generations before, though the family fortune had thinned considerably by the time it reached him. down to a modest spread of grazing land on the good side of Cold Iron Ridge. Daniel dreamed in cattle and grass the way other men dreamed in gold, and Cassandra, who had grown up believing that most things called ruined were only unread, saw in him the same quality she saw in a stiff old hide: worth, if you were patient enough to work it. Together they built the Ashford spread back up out of near nothing, she keeping the books and mending every strap and saddle and boot on the place herself, sewing the harness for half the ranches on the ridge, besides for a little extra coin. He running the cattle over grass that had belonged, by old custom, and by an even older grant no one living had ever actually seen, to every rancher on the ridge in common. In the evenings, when the work allowed it, Daniel liked to sit on the porch step and talk about the men who had first settled that ridge, about how they had agreed, in a spirit he found almost holy, to share the high grass rather than fence and fight over it the way ranchers did further south. And Cassandra would listen and mend by lamplight and think that she had married into something larger and steadier than one family's luck. They had one daughter, Eliza, who died of the diphtheria at 4 years old, in the same terrible week that took 2 other children on the ridge, and that grief did not break Cassandra and Daniel so much as fuse them, the way a hide fuses at the place it has been stitched and pulled tight. Naomi came out from town to sit with her daughter through the worst of those nights and told her, in the same low birthing room voice, that grief too could not be hurried past, only carried through, one slow hour at a time. And Cassandra held on to that, the way she had held on to every other patient thing her mother had ever taught her. For 9 years after, she and Daniel were, if not rich, entirely their own, running a small, honest herd and a saddle shop out of the barn that brought in enough trade from up and down the ridge that neighbors began to say the Ashford place was as much a crossroads as a ranch. Cassandra believed, the way settled people believe, that a life built slowly with your own hands could not simply be taken from you by a man with a pen. She would learn in time exactly how wrong a settled woman could be. She learned otherwise the winter the cattle prices broke. It was not the first hard winter Ashford Hollow had seen, but it came on the heels of 2 dry summers and a railroad spur that never got built, and half the ranchers on the ridge found themselves owing more than their herds were worth, Daniel among them. It was Thaddeus Kane, president of the only bank between the Hollow and the county seat, who held nearly every note in the valley by then, and Kane had built his fortune the patient way, buying up notes cheap in good years and calling them due in bad ones, always with the same soft regret in his voice, always careful to be seen doing nothing improper. He had a particular gift, the neighbors said behind their hands, for arriving at a family's door in the exact week their luck turned, offering terms that felt, in the moment, like a lifeline, and revealing themselves only a season or 2 later to have been a noose measured in advance. Daniel went to him that winter for what should have been an ordinary extension, the kind neighbors granted neighbors, and came home with his face gray in a way Cassandra had never seen on him, because Kane had told him, gently, that the bank could no longer be so generous to ranchers whose grazing rights themselves were, as it happened, a matter of some legal uncertainty. Given that the old common grant to the ridge had never been properly recorded in the county's memory, only in the memory of old men. It was the first time Cassandra heard the word that would come to define the rest of her life: uncertainty. Kane had a genius for finding the one loose thread in a man's confidence and pulling it slowly enough that the man himself helped unravel his own coat. That winter she watched the same soft ruin visited on 2 other families along the ridge, the Odells and the widowed Sorensen sisters. Watched Kane call notes and buy parcels through agents who did not trouble to hide whose money they carried, and she began, without fully admitting it to herself, to notice a pattern in it, the way her father had taught her to notice the pattern of wear in a saddle before the leather finally gave. Every family Kane pressed hardest seemed to be one whose grazing rested on the old common grant rather than a private deed, and she filed that, noticing away the way you file away a stray thread that might, someday, turn out to matter, though she had no earthly notion yet how much it would. Daniel died that same winter, not of illness, but of a fall from a horse in a whiteout while riding fence he did not trust anyone else to ride, and Cassandra always believed, though she could never prove it, and stopped trying to, that a man with worry enough on him rides carelessly. She buried him on the ridge above the house where he had loved to sit and watch the cattle move like slow weather across the grass, beside the small stone they had already set for Eliza. And she was not yet a season into her grief when Cain's foreclosure notice arrived, citing a debt Daniel had carried for the extension he'd been so gently denied, a debt Cain now called in full, in the dead of her mourning, with a courtesy so smooth. It took her 3 readings of the letter to understand she was being put off her own land. She fought it the only way a woman with no standing in that county could fight anything, which was to ask, and to be told no, gently, by a magistrate who owed his seat to Cain's endorsement, and a clerk who could not meet her eye. She went twice to Cain's own office, ledgers open between them, and offered him the harness trade, the herd spring calves, anything that might buy her even a season's grace. And he folded his soft hands on the desk and told her that business was business, and that he was, in truth, doing a grieving woman a kindness once settling the matter cleanly rather than letting it drag on and deepen her debt. The auction, when it came, took 11 minutes. Cain bought the Ashford spread himself, through an agent who did not trouble to hide whose money he carried. And Cassandra Whitfield walked off the only home she had made in this life with a mule, her father's satchel of tools, and $6 silver, Daniel had once told her, half joking, to keep hidden against exactly this kind of day. Because a saddler's daughter ought never trust a bank with the whole of anything. She spent her first night in the loft of the church, on the charity of a minister who had buried her husband and her daughter both, and could not, in good conscience, do less than offer her a floor, and she lay awake doing the arithmetic her mother had taught her never to do too fast. $6. No land, no cattle, no name a bank would honor. And a whole ridge of neighbors who had watched Cain do this same soft, careful thing to 3 other families in as many years and had learned, the way frightened people learn, to look away quickly when it happened to someone else. By dawn, she had not decided anything except that she would not leave Ashford Hollow a beggar, though she had not the first idea how a woman managed that with $6. Her father's voice was steady in her, patient as an awl finding the grain. Any fool can see a good hide. It takes patience to see the good hide inside a bad one. The Widow's Folly sat on the scorched shoulder of Cold Iron Ridge above the old grazing common, a windmill built 30 years before by the valley's original settlers to pump water for cattle that no longer ran there. Its wooden sails long since burned away in a fire nobody could quite explain. Its stone base, cracked and blackened and shunned by every soul in the county. The story, as the townsfolk told it with a certain relish, was that the mill had burned the same autumn the old common grant went missing from the county recorder's office. The same autumn 3 of the original founding ranchers had died within a season of each other. Of fever, an accident, and, in one case, no cause anyone would name aloud, and that whatever ill luck lived on that ridge had not gone anywhere in the 11 years since. No one grazed cattle within a half-mile of it if they could help it. Children were warned off it the way children in other towns were warned off a swimming hole with a current. Cassandra heard the story from the minister's wife over breakfast, meant as a kindness, a warning to a grieving woman not to wander up that way, and heard a fuller, gaudier version of it that same afternoon from 2 women at the mercantile who did not know she was listening. One of them, swearing her own grandfather, had seen a light burning in the mill's dead windows on a night. 11 years passed, when not a soul was living, and Cassandra felt, the way her father used to feel a scar hiding under good leather, that a story repeated that carefully by that many frightened people was usually hiding something a great deal more ordinary and a great deal more dangerous than a curse. She rode up to the ridge that same afternoon and found the county surveyor's mark still nailed to a post near the base, listing the parcel as unclaimed and available against back taxes of $5, a sum so small it told her plainly that no one had wanted it badly enough to pay even that in 11 years. The clerk back in town laughed outright when she came to claim it, told her she was buying a widowmaker to match her own name, called another clerk over to share the joke before he'd even wet his pen, and wrote the deed anyway because $5 was $5, and a fool's money spent the same as any other. Cassandra thanked him without irony, the way her mother had taught her to thank the world for whatever small mercy it offered, and rode back out to the ridge before sundown with a bedroll and her father's tools and began, the very next morning, to do the only thing she had ever known how to do with a ruined thing, which was to look at it slowly and ask what it still wanted to be. She did not go looking for treasure. She went looking for shelter she could hold in her own name, a stone base with 4 solid walls where a woman with almost nothing could at least be dry and unbothered while she decided what came next. Word of where she had gone reached the Ridge families quickly, and more than one neighbor rode up in those first days to offer her a room instead, out of pity or unease at seeing a grieving widow camped by the cursed mill, and she thanked each of them and declined because she had learned enough of Ashford Hollow's charity in the weeks since Daniel's death to know it came with a shelf life, and because something in the stubborn set of that scorched stone tower had already begun to interest her the way a hard, honest problem always had. She spent her first days simply clearing the burned timbers and ash from the mill's lower chamber, sweeping and hauling and shoring up a sagging lintel with a jack she borrowed from the livery in trade for restitching a set of harness, working from first light until her hands blistered, and then, patiently, calloused, and it was on the 5th day, running her palm slow along the base of the north wall, the way her father had taught her to run a palm along a hide, feeling for the place where the material told a different story than its face, that she found a seam in the stonework that did not belong. It was mortar too fine, too deliberate, a rectangle no taller than a door, and set back half an inch from the wall around it, hidden under a skin of soot. So uniform it had clearly been rubbed on by hand rather than left by any fire. Somebody had built a door into that wall and then worked very hard to make it look like there was no door there at all. She sat back on her heels a long while, staring at that seam, and felt the old quickening her father used to describe, the moment a hide stopped being simply a hide and became, instead, a question with an answer waiting inside it. She did not tell the minister or his wife what she had found, nor the neighbors who still rode up now and again to check on her, because some instinct, sharpened by watching Kane work all winter, told her that whatever this ridge was hiding, it had been hidden on purpose, and things hidden on purpose are rarely safe to speak of before you understand why. It took her 4 days of patient, unhurried work to open it, chiseling the mortar loose a thumb's width at a time so the stones above would not shift and come down on her, working mostly after dark by a shuttered lamp so that no passing rider would see light where the county swore no light should be, resting her wrists when they cramped, and returning to the chisel only when her breathing had settled, the way her mother had taught her to pace a long labor rather than fight it. On the evening of the 4th day, the last block came free, and a breath of old, dry, mineral-smelling air rolled out of a cavity no bigger than a pantry, and Cassandra held her lamp into the dark and found, sitting upright against the back wall as though he had simply chosen to rest there and never risen, the bones of a man in a surveyor's coat and cradled in the crook of his arm, wrapped twice over in oilcloth gone stiff with age, a long flat document case stamped with the seal of the Territorial Land Office. She did not cry out, though her heart went hard against her ribs, and she held the lamp very still for a long moment, the way her mother had taught her to hold still in a birthing room when the room itself seemed to be asking for quiet. She did not touch the bones that night beyond a murmured apology she barely heard herself say, and she did not sleep either, sitting instead just outside the opening with her knees drawn up, turning over in her mind everything a stranger's forgotten body could mean to a woman who had already lost more than she had left to lose. In the morning, with the ridge lit gray and ordinary around her, she went back in and carried the document case out into the daylight, working the buckles loose with fingers that knew leather well enough to be gentle with what had survived 11 years better than it had any right to. Inside, dry and whole, she found the true shape of what had been done to Ashford Hollow. There was the original common grant, the very document the whole valley believed lost, signed, and sealed and witnessed, establishing beyond any lawyer's argument that the grazing lands of Cold Iron Ridge belonged not to any one rancher, but to the founding families of the valley in common, in perpetuity, exactly the old men's memory that Kane had told Daniel could not be proven. And beneath the grant, in a surveyor's careful hand, was a journal, and the journal told her who the dead man was and why he had died, walled into a burning windmill with the one document that could have saved a valley clutched against his chest. His name had been Amos Teague, the county surveyor of record 11 years before, and he had discovered, in the ordinary course of replanting the ridge, that the common grant on file at the recorder's office was a forgery, a careful and convincing copy substituted for the real one, so that the actual grazing rights could be quietly bought up parcel by parcel from ranchers who no longer had any paper proof they held anything in common at all. He had traced the substitution to a young bank clerk new to the county that same year, a clerk whose name he wrote in the journal in a hand gone tight with anger, Thaddeus Kane. The early pages of the journal read almost like a ledger themselves, dates and observations, the small, dry satisfaction of a careful man closing in on a fact, and then, over a handful of entries, the tone changed. Teague wrote of being followed on the road out to the county seat. He wrote of a letter he had sent to the territorial land office in Helena that never arrived and never was answered, though he could find no honest reason it should have gone astray. He wrote, in the second-to-last entry, that he no longer trusted the recorder's office to hold copies of anything he valued, and that he had decided to carry the true grant somewhere no one connected to the bank would think to look, at least until he could deliver it into hands outside the county entirely. He had ridden out to the Windmill, then a working structure on common land, to hide the true grant somewhere Kane would never look, meaning to carry it to the territorial capital himself once he had gathered enough proof to make the charge stick. He never got the chance. The journal's last entries, written in a hand growing rougher and more desperate by the page, described being pursued, cornered in the mill by men he did not name but plainly feared, the sails already burning above him by the time he understood there was no riding away from it, and no way out but the one he made himself. He wrote that he had decided to wall himself into the stone base with the document, in the hope that fire could not reach what stone protected, and that someday someone patient enough to look past a story of curses and bad luck would find what he had died protecting. The very last line, the ink gone thin as though the lamp itself had been failing him, was not a farewell but an instruction, addressed to no one in particular and to whoever came after all at once. Find whoever still owns a piece of this ridge honestly and give it back to all of them, not one. He had not lived to see whether anyone ever would. Cassandra Whitfield, sitting on the cold floor of a mill the whole town called cursed, understood that she was holding the entire secret of Thaddeus Kane's fortune in her two hands, and that every acre he had bought cheap, and every note he had called due in the 11 years since had been built on a forgery. A dead surveyor's bones were guarding. She sat with Amos Teague's bones a long while after that, in a silence that felt less frightening now than it had the night before, and she found herself speaking to him quietly, the way she had once spoken to Eliza's small stone on the ridge, telling a dead stranger that she understood now, and that she would not let his patience go to waste. She told no one for 5 days, because she understood, the way her mother had understood the danger of rushing anything fragile, that a widow with no standing waving a dead man's proof at the richest man in the county would be dismissed, or worse, before the words were fully out of her mouth. She read the grant until she could recite it. She read the journal until she understood exactly which parcels Kane had bought on the strength of the false document, which included, she now knew with a coldness that settled into her like a stitched seam pulled tight, her own late husband's ranch and the Odell place, and the ground the Sorensen sisters had lost the autumn before. She rode down twice into town in those 5 days for supplies and behaved, so far as anyone could tell, exactly like a grieving widow slowly rebuilding a burned-out ruin, exchanging small news with the mercantile owner, letting the minister's wife believe she was simply keeping busy against her sorrow, and all the while turning over in her mind, at night, by the shuttered lamp, exactly how a woman with no money and no standing could move a truth this size safely from her own 2 hands into the hands of an entire valley without Kane's soft machinery closing over it first. She thought, in her most honest hours, of what it would mean to take the grant straight to Kane himself, to trade his fear of exposure for the quiet return of her own land alone, and let the rest of the ridge go on paying him as they always had. It would have been the easier path, and no one on earth but herself and a dead man's bones would ever have known she'd had the choice at all. She sat with that thought a long while, turning it the way her father turned a hide before he cut it, testing where it would bend and where it would tear, and she found, in the end, that it would not hold, because a grant meant to belong to a whole valley and common could not be honestly used to buy back one woman's peace while every neighbor who had lost the same way stayed lost. She thought of the Odell's boy, who had stopped coming to school the winter his family's grazing went, and of the Sorensen sisters, who had taken in washing to survive. Amos Teague had died rather than let one man own what belonged to everyone. She would not make a liar of a dead man's patience. Cain came to the ridge himself on the 6th day, having heard, as such men always hear, that the widow had been seen hauling stone and burning candles late at the folly, and he rode up in his good coat with 2 men trailing him, and the easy, unhurried manner of a man who has never once in his life been made to wait for anything he wanted. He stood at the base of the mill and looked up at the new cleared doorway with an expression of pleasant concern, remarking that he'd heard she'd taken quite the notion clearing out a place with such an unlucky history, and offered her, with great warmth, $75 for the mill and whatever foolishness she'd found in it, sight unseen. A staggering sum to a woman who had owned $6 a week before. He watched her face carefully as the number landed, the way he had watched Daniel's face across a desk of open ledgers, and when it did not land the way he expected, when she only studied him with her father's slow, reading patience, and told him she would think on it, he raised the offer twice more before the softness finally went out of his voice, remarking, with a thin edge now showing under the courtesy, that a woman alone had no real use for a burned ruin on a bad ridge, and that he was, in truth, doing her a kindness by taking a headache off her hands before winter made it worse. Cassandra thanked him for his generosity and told him she would send word, and she watched him ride back down the ridge already, she was certain, arranging the next soft machinery he would use to take this from her the way he had taken everything else. She did not wait for it to arrive. 2 mornings later, she rode into Ashford Hollow and asked the minister who had given her his church floor for the use of the church itself, and she sent word by every child and neighbor and kindly soul who would carry it that the widow Whitfield had something to say about the ridge, and that any family who had ever lost grazing rights to the bank, or feared to, ought to come and hear it on Sunday evening, after the regular service, when the whole valley would already be gathered in one room, without Cain having had cause to wonder why. They came, filling the pews the way frightened, weary people fill a room when they sense, without yet knowing why, that the room might finally hold an answer. The Odells and the Sorensen sisters, and a dozen other families who had watched their own ground go the same soft, quiet way over the years. Cain came too, near the back, arms folded, because a man like Cain could not bear not to be present for whatever was about to be said about him, and Cassandra saw him settle himself with the unhurried confidence of a man who still believed, even then, that whatever a grieving widow had found in a burned tower could not possibly outweigh a bank president's word. Cassandra stood at the front with Amos Teague's document case under her arm and did not raise her voice, because she had learned from a lifetime of leather that the truth, laid out plainly, does not need to shout to be believed. She told the room first, simply, what she had found sealed in the mill's stone base, and watched the room's disbelief settle into something quieter as she read them the original grant word for word, the eagle and the seal, and the founder's own names among the witnesses, and watched the slow, traveling recognition move pew by pew as families realized they were hearing, for the first time in 11 years, the actual terms their grandfathers had agreed to. Then she read them Amos Teague's journal, his own careful hand describing his own murder in everything but name, his instruction at the very end to give the land back to all of them and not one, and she told them, in plain, unhurried words, exactly whose bank clerk had forged the paper that had been quietly starving them for 11 years, and that he was standing at the back of their own church. The room did the same slow, terrible arithmetic that a town does when it is finally handed the shape of a thing it has felt in its bones for years without daring to name it, and it turned, family by family, to look at Thaddeus Cain, and what it found in his face was not the outrage of an innocent man, but the stillness of a man watching his whole fortune come apart in real time. He tried, for a moment, the same soft voice that had worked on a dozen frightened people before, calling it a grieving woman's confusion, offering to have his own lawyer examine the papers for authenticity as a service to the valley. And it was old Odell himself, a quiet man who had said little in that church in 20 years, who stood up from his pew and asked, in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, why a bank clerk new to the county, the very autumn the true grant vanished, would have any particular interest in examining it now. There was no violence and no mob, only a church full of neighbors who now knew precisely what he was, and a document, witnessed by a dead man's careful hand, that 200 people had now seen with their own eyes, and that could never again be quietly made to disappear. A rancher whose family had lost half their herd to Kane's called-in notes, offered on the spot to ride the grant to the territorial land office himself, first thing in the morning, with 2 other men riding alongside him so that no accident could conveniently befall him on the road. The minister offered the church cellar to keep the document case safe until then. Kane, who understood ruin better than any man in that room because he had built his fortune out of dispensing it, did the arithmetic of his own position in the time it takes a room to finish turning, and he rose without another word and walked out of the church into the dark. And within the season, he had sold his interest in the bank and left the county entirely. And Ashford Hollow spoke his name afterward. The way you speak of a bad winter, as something survived rather than something missed. What Cassandra did with what she had found was, in the end, exactly what Amos Teague had died hoping someone would do. She did not use the grant to buy back only her own ranch and let the rest of the ridge fend for itself, though every soul in that church that night would have understood if she had. She stood before them and placed the restored common grant into the trust of the valley's ranching families as a body, recorded properly at last at the county office, under the watch of 3 witnesses so it could never again be quietly substituted, so that the grazing rights above Cold Iron Ridge could never again be quietly forged away from under people too tired to watch closely enough. The parcels Kane had bought on the strength of his forgery were voided one by one as the true grant took hold, and over the following months the Odells got back the corner of range they'd lost, and the Sorensen sisters gave up their washing and returned to running cattle their father had once run, and the Ashford spread, Daniel's spread, came back into Cassandra's hands, not as a gift she had angled for, but as simple consequence of the truth being finally recorded where it belonged. She kept the windmill for herself, the one thing on that ridge that was hers by right of patience rather than restitution. And she rebuilt its sails herself with her father's tools that winter, teaching herself the carpentry she did not already know, the same slow way she had once learned to read a hide, and turned the stone base where Amos Teague had waited 11 years into a saddler's shop, mending harness and tack for a valley that had learned, at last, to look twice at what it had been too frightened to examine closely. She saw to it, too, that Amos Teague was carried down off the ridge and buried properly in the town cemetery, under a stone that named him plainly as the county surveyor who had died protecting the valley's grazing rights, and every spring after, someone on the ridge, often a child who had never known the man or the danger he died in, laid wildflowers on that grave without quite being able to say why it mattered, only that it did. She was 43 years old. The spring, they nailed a foreclosure notice to her door and watched her carry out her dead husband's boots in a crate, and they had been so certain of their arithmetic, so certain that a widow with $6 sewn into her glove was a problem already solved. They mocked her for spending her last coin on a burned tower every soul in the county called cursed, and they were right that it looked like ruin and wrong about every single thing they meant by it. Because a thing that looks cursed is very often only a thing that someone patient enough never got the chance to explain. And Cassandra Whitfield had spent her whole life learning to read the good hide hiding inside the bad one. What was sealed inside that mill did lift her out of the ashes exactly as we promised, and it lifted a whole valley's stolen birthright back into its own hands beside her because she understood, the way her father and mother had both tried to teach her long before she needed to know it, that the truest patience is not the kind that waits only for your own turn to come, but the kind that waits long enough to bring everyone else's along with it. Thank you for staying with us all the way to the end of Cassandra's story tonight. It means more than you know that you spent this quiet half hour here with us. If her story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear that the thing the world has already decided is worthless might be the very thing that saves them. And before you go, tell us in the comments the answer to the one question this whole story was really asking. When in your own life did you look twice at something everyone else had already written off and find real value hiding underneath? We read every answer, and we carry them with us into the next story. Until then, be patient with the tired and broken things. Be patient with yourself, and remember that a great deal of what looks like ruin is only waiting for the right pair of hands. From all of us, thank you, good night, and until next time, stay close.